This meeting is being recorded. All right. So tonight I want to go over the new FCC rules on RF exposure. A new guideline came out for May 3rd, 2021. Um, and I didn't know anything about it. And I watched a YouTube video on it, got me reading about it, and it just kind of reminded me of um, some of the stuff I should have known a little bit earlier. Um, Let me share my screen. Please let me know if this works. You should see all sorts of junk. Um, all right, you see a Word document? Oh, my screen's going nuts. Okay, as soon as I talk, it flips out. Can anybody tell me if you're seeing a Word document?
Yeah, yes.
Excellent. Um, so this is stuff we learned. It's in every one of the test sessions. You need to know about RF exposure. Why do we care about RF exposure, or kind of the history a little bit about it? The IEEE did a white paper in like '91, I think it was, on what they thought was a good way to calculate or understand RF exposure. In '98 was the first time the FCC adopted an RF exposure plan. So since 1998, hams have had to know what their exposure limits are and make sure they didn't cause any problems. Um, the FCC rules are, you can see at the top, FCC Office of Engineering and Technology Bulletin 65. And then the amateur radio part is actually called Supplement B. It's a bit of an interesting read. It's a bit of a nerdy read, but it's kind of interesting. And there's a lot of examples. If you look at the beginning, the people that wrote it, there's an awful lot of call signs in there. So it's pretty ham centric, reasonably well done. And really, what they're trying to do is determine the maximum permissible exposure, and that's milliwatts per square centimeter. Anybody that's taken any radiation training, it's RF exposure is kind of similar to radiation as far as time, distance, and shielding. The further away you are from it, the shorter the exposure you have to it, the more shielding you have in between you and the radiation is what you're looking for. And RF is fairly similar. RF, we're talking about non-ionizing radiation here. Ionizing is going to be much higher frequency, or it's going to be your gamma rays and things like that. And ionizing's when it's actually breaking down the cells. We don't want that. This is non-ionizing exposure is basically just heating the cells. And for the most part, that if it's the short enough time or small enough intensity, isn't going to cause a problem, but it can, and you don't want that. One thing that you're going to read or see about here is there's two different levels they're talking about, controlled versus uncontrolled. Controlled environments and uncontrolled environments. The difference is controlled is an educated person, meaning you are using your radio, your antenna, things like that. If you're in that area, you know about the radio, you know that there's RF being transmitted, you know that there's an exposure. Uncontrolled is the general public, the person walking down the street, the next door neighbor. So in uncontrolled environments, you have to assume that that area is occupied at all times. And really what it is it's a time weighted average, 6 minutes versus 30 minutes. So in the controlled area, the assumption in all these math problems and everything is that you understand that there's an RF exposure there. That's really the big difference. Up until, well, yeah, until May 2nd of this year, there were 4 different ways you could meet the requirements. You could be exempted if you're an amateur. You can do a calculation, you can do antenna modeling, or you can do direct measurement. The difference, what changed on May 2nd, is that the exemption line is now gone. There are no exemptions, and I'll explain in a little bit more in a minute. Well, no, I'll explain now. Really, what it was is, and I'll show you, there was a chart, and most people have probably seen this at one point in time or another. There was a chart. If you were operating on 80 meters and you were 500 watts or less, you were exempted. You didn't have to worry about it. And so you just went down through the chart and see if you were within those boundaries. If you were good. You didn't have to do anything else. As of May 3rd this year, if you create a new station or if you change your existing station to the point where you add more power or change the radiation pattern of your antenna, you need to now do an evaluation of your station, which means a calculation, an antenna model, or a measurement. There is no exemption. May 3rd, 2023, so 2 years from now, all amateur stations will have to evaluate their station. There will be no, right now it's only if you change something. And this rule was passed in 2019, so it's been 2 years for people to be prepared for it. And really the reason, so nothing has changed in the calculations. It's exactly the same formulas and everything. Really the reason they changed it is to standardize the rules across all of the different services. So broadcast stations, ham radio, cell phones, whatever. They basically all have the same rules now, which they had the same formulas before, but they were a little bit different rules. It's just kind of some housekeeping, and if you read it, it kind of makes sense. The way it was written before, this came directly from the FCC OET Bulletin 65 Supplement B. It said no station is exempt from compliance with the FCC rules and with the maximum permissible exposure limits. However, many amateur stations that are categorically exempt from the requirements to perform a routine evaluation for compliance. So before, you didn't necessarily have to do, if you were below those limits, you didn't have to do the evaluation. Now, or within 2 years from now, everyone's going to have to do the evaluation. It doesn't mean you have to report it to the FCC. You don't have to write it down even. You'll see here in a minute with some of these calculators, what most people are suggesting that I've read is, you run the simulation, or you run the calculation through the online simulator, you print out the results and you keep it in your desk, or you save a copy of it, something like that. If there's ever a problem, it's not that the FCC is going around and checking stations for this. It's if they're, the main goal of the whole thing is just to be within compliance, to make sure that you're not creating an unsafe situation for someone. It's pretty straightforward that way. Let's see how bad my, I guess that's it. So these are the links that I sent out. There's really 4 that I've been using that are pretty helpful. There's an online Lake Washington Ham Club calculator. There's a download, the Ham Radio School Calculator spreadsheet. That's actually an Excel spreadsheet. There's a coax loss calculator that you can use, and then the ARRL has a pretty lengthy RF exposure page with a lot of resources on that. And that's one I would suggest if you're interested in learning more about this, to go there. Questions, comments, thoughts? All right, I'm just going to run through the exposure calculator here pretty quick. It's really pretty simple, and honestly, most people are not going to be affected by it. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to bring up, this is the old exemption chart. So for most people, if you're if you're working 15 meters to 160, most people are running 100 watts, you're exempt, no problem. VHF bands, most people were working, a mobile. So I guess the place that most hams would get have problems is on 12, 10, and 6 meters. I think most people are using, like 2 meters, you're doing 50 watts or something like that. And if you notice, the chart goes down, 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 and then when you get into the VHF bands, that's kind of the most restrictive, and then they start going up again. And really, the main thing about that, the main reason for that is that the size of the human body. You are the human. I forget. I read, the average human body is resonant at like 130 megahertz or something like that. So I guess if you could put an SMA adapter into you somewhere, you could, do UHF work. But so that's why it's most restrictive. They also talked about the fact that it's not necessarily the entire body that you're worried about. Like your head is smaller than the rest of your body. So you're going to be a resonant at a higher frequency. So, like UHF and stuff can still be, problematic. So that's why that's why the dip is there, is because of the size of the human body. I'm going to run through a couple examples on this. This is the online calculator. Like I say, I put the link in the chat. You're going to see real quick that most people are going to be pretty fine. The suggestion that I saw, and I think I agree with, is run through this, do it pretty conservatively. You're probably going to see that you're in good shape. However, if you're starting to get close to the limits, or when you start to get close to being problematic, that's when you're going to want to go into some more detail. And I'll give you a couple suggestions how to do that later. So honestly, the first thing that I was looking for is I run around and do Parks on the Air or state QSO parties with, I'm sitting in the front seat of my El Camino with a 7300, and I got a Wolf River coil vertical in the bed of the El Camino, 3 feet away from me. So let's do that. 100 watts. The duty mode cycle, or mode duty cycle, it's 20% for conversational sideband, no speech processing. Sideband, heavy speech processing is 50%. 40% for CW, and then FM, AM, a lot of the digital modes are all 100% duty cycle. So single sideband, 50% duty cycle, and then your transmit duty cycle. This is, if you're sitting there rag chewing, it's probably going to go down a fair bit. When I'm contesting, I'm probably as close to 50-50 as I can be, because I'm moving along pretty quick. So they're doing it in minutes, so the shortest I can easily do is 1 minute on, 1 minute off. Antenna gain, 2.2 is the gain of the average dipole. A vertical, as far as I recall, a vertical is usually a little bit less than the dipole. So again, I'm going to be kind of conservative and make it higher than it might be. I usually operate on 20 meters. And then there's another one here, include ground effects of ground reflections. This again makes it more conservative. This is going to give you a higher value, so I just have included it. You just hit calculate. And then down here at the bottom, for for a controlled environment, the actual figure for the maximum allowed power density is here, and the minimum safe distance is 1.4352 feet. So as you can see, it's pretty safe. For an uncontrolled environment, you're supposed to be 3 feet away. So if you're out doing parks on the air and you got an antenna clamped to the end of the park bench, and people are walking by, they're probably, if somebody's sitting there, standing there talking to you and want to know what's going on while you're chatting on the air, maybe you don't want to chat on the air while that person's leaning against the antenna. If they stand on the other end of the park bench, you can probably talk without any problems. Um, and as you can see, I did everything fairly conservative here. My ICOM puts out 100 watts in theory. I go through a feed line, which there's loss in that. So it's less than 100 watts. I'm on a battery, so it's going to choke that back a little bit. So really, I'm probably putting 80 watts into the antenna itself. The duty cycle is about right. The antenna gain is probably a little bit less than that. But, and you can see it went down to 2.8 feet. So you're pretty safe in that. The people that are going to be problematic are people who have an antenna close to someone else. If you live in an apartment and you got an antenna on your balcony, Mike, I know you've had concerns in the past. You live close to other people. And then the other thing is if you're running power or if you're running higher frequency. So if you want to run the UHF VHF contest, let's do power first. Let's do 1,000 watts. You're doing some FT8 because you want to be able to really nuke things. Transmit cycle's pretty good. Oh, we're gonna have a beam because why not? 1,000 watts on FT8 with a Yagi. Well, let's go really crazy. Let's do it. We're gonna do it on 10 meters. Oh no, even better. Let's do it on 6 meters. So, as you can see, for uncontrolled, so you need to be able to keep that antenna that antenna needs to be 50 feet away. People can't be within 50 feet of that. Now remember, 50 feet is going to be, you now have a directional antenna. So if the person's standing directly underneath it, this is where you can get into, if you really do have a problematic area, you can get into antenna modeling to decide if this is going to be problematic or not. And again, you don't have to report any of this to the FCC. It's really just so that you can say in good faith that you know that you're not harming someone else. If your antenna is at 30 feet elevation and it's right on your property line and your neighbor is only about 35 feet from your antenna, but they have a one-story house, your antenna is at 30 feet, you're probably going to be fine here because that takeoff angle is going to be going upward. But if you're getting that close to being problematic, you're going to want to do a little bit more calculations and just kind of justify your case a little bit better.
Hey,
But
RJ.
again, that's when you're getting high up. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, you want to run something?
Sure.
I've got one for you.
Sure.
Because my neighbors are living so close, and I'm using that 2 element 40 meter Yagi. Sometimes I'm running a kilowatt, and it's at 63 feet. And they've got a 2-story house, and it's not too far away. It's probably 30 feet away.
All right.
So we're talking a kilowatt in
Do you ever run, are you only sideband or do you run anything else?
yeah, pretty much just single sideband with heavy speech processing.
And the one thing to remember is the burden is on you to go with anything that you possibly would do. So,
Right.
if 95% of the time you do sideband, but you do FT8 5% of the time, you really need to run the calculation for FT8. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yep, that makes perfect sense. But 99% of my operation is on sideband.
Sideband. Okay.
So yeah. And let's see. Yeah, 1 minute, 1 minute. That's good. The gain to the antenna is probably somewhere around. I would say 5 dB, maybe 5 dB gain. Um, And operating frequency, let's just pick one. 7,200. Yep.
So uncontrolled, the minimum safe distance is 7 feet. When you get down in those, when you get down in those low bands, it's really, because if you think about it, it's back. I told you that the human body's resonant, kind of in the 2 meter range. When you get to 40 meters, I mean, so little of a wave is passing through your body at one time.
And it's not so highly concentrated like a VHF signal, 100% duty cycle, and all that.
Exactly.
Or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Exactly. Let me bring up the other one that I sent the link to is the spreadsheet, and this is just done a little bit different. So this actually shows your feed line. Before I do this, I take that back. I'm going to jump back in here. The coax calculator. I think most people have seen this before. This is the one that I use. It's QSL.net coax calculator. They got a nice chart up here, so it kind of converts between the Belden numbers and kind of the generic numbers. So for me, in my El Camino example, I've got a 50-foot length of LMR 240. Typically running 20 meters, 1-to-1 SWR, 100 watts. Calculate, that shows that I've got 0.461 dB loss, total loss, and you can, if you play with this a little bit, say like a 1.5 to 1 SWR, really doesn't add that much. So you really don't have to get too excited about that. But so it shows that I'm putting 100, or with my 100 watt radio, I'm putting 89 watts into the antenna. So come over here to this one, just 100 watts. Stupid thing. 100 watts. I take that back. So the way I kind of use this is I do that calculation on the other one. So it says 89 watts. The feed line dB I just put as 0 because I like doing the calculation in the other. Transmit percentage, all that stuff. Antenna gain, I'm going to go back to 2.2. And then this is telling you this one's asking you, how far away are you worried about somebody being? So for me, I'm in the back of the El Caminos, that's 3 feet. And then if you scroll down, it tells you the power density with ground reflection and without. And then it tells you if you are within compliance or not for uncontrolled and controlled. It's just a different way of doing it. If the person was 1 foot away, the control is yes and the uncontrolled no. It's, like I say, it's just a different way to do the beast. But generically, what I'm showing you here, and you can see that the calculation is pretty darn easy to do, and it is in the general HF bands, it's pretty easy to get yourself to the point where you're not a danger to anyone. Really what the onus is that you just have an understanding of it. So if you're out working portable, and honestly, if you're not aggravating, I mean, I would have a really hard time aggravating my neighbors or having some reason to cause a problem out here. So the chances of the FCC coming to look at me is just about zilch. But it's a good thing to know. I spent a little bit of time doing some reading. Like I say, the coax calculator. This page is very good. The RF. If you just I sent the link out, and if you just send or search for ARRL RF exposure, they've kind of got a one-page all about stuff with a couple of different links. and it's pretty straightforward. They got a frequently asked questions page. That's pretty good, and it's pretty straightforward. Oh, the other thing that got brought up a fair amount, SAR, specific absorption rate testing. This is something else that's that's a change in the standard. It doesn't affect the average ham directly. It changes how HTs have to be tested. Previously, I'm going to stop. Well, no, I'm not going to do that yet. Previously, amateur radio HTs are exempted from specific absorption rate testing. And that's the testing that's done, say, on cell phones and things like that. It's done with $1 million equipment. It's not something that we're going to do. HTs are no longer exempted. It doesn't change two things. One, it's not something that the end user needs to do. It's something that the manufacturer has to do. And number two, all HTs that were in manufacture from May 3rd and previously are exempted. So it's not that all models that were manufactured, not the actual unit, the model. So if you go buy a Kenwood D74, it's exempted because they were already producing it before this regulation went into effect. So any brand new HTs from May 3rd going forward, brand new model HTs would actually have to go through the SAR test, which is very, like I say, they're doing it for cell phones and they're already doing it for commercial radios. And I read that a lot of the ham radios are based on commercial radios, and the ARRL is working with the FCC and the manufacturers to try to be able to take the SAR tests that were done for the commercial models and just use that on the ham models. So it's something you may see coming down the road, but it's nothing that's going to affect you directly. Make sense? Questions, thoughts? Did I get anything terribly wrong, Arnie? Well, I talked a little bit about science type stuff. You know,
So if you don't know the antenna gain of, well, like I got a G5 RV, it's 100 foot long.
Right.
Uh,
So
I'm from-
you can do two things. One, there are free programs like EasyNac and the MA Gal or whatever that Sean reviewed for us a couple months ago. Or you can use I'm sure there's somebody out there that sells a G5 RV that has a gain calculation on it somewhere.
Well, and I can look. It's a Radio Works, so they may have something. So I'll
Yeah.
have to look.
And in all reality, honestly, if you just kind of, get a good faith effort on what it is, and just round up, just make it more, if for me, when I was doing my calculations for my kind of mobile setup, I just did everything a little bit on the conservative side, and I still was fine. So
Okay.
really, unless you're running a bunch of power into it, you're pretty. Most of the time, the antenna is higher in the air than the amount of distance you need to be away from it.
Yeah, it's about 25 feet, and I'm usually running about 90 watts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, unless you get into the VHF frequencies and are running some real power, or some crazy gain, and even then, like I showed you, it's pretty. It's obviously more the closer you are to neighbors and sidewalks and people, and if you live in a one-story house and you got your antenna, and your neighbors are in a three-story house, well, guess what? Now you're gonna have a little more problem, but. Hence the reason if everybody lived in the middle of nowhere, it'd just be easier.
Yeah.
But I
They were
have had a
doing
few people walk by me when I'm doing parks on the air stuff, and and it's good to have a reasonable. I knew, basically what I did is somebody walked by me, I just stopped transmitting for that short period of time. But it's nice to have a little bit more of a specific answer to what the distance is.
Yeah, anytime you're in an environment like that, I mean, if you're on doing field day or whatever,
Yeah,
I mean, we're all cognizant of the fact that, you don't want to get near Billy Bob over here when he's on the vertical and he's got, 100 watts going out. You don't want to get close to it. And it's the education thing for anybody that doesn't know that. I mean, and you're right, stop transmitting and stuff. But we were doing microwave installs up on Saddleback, and we were doing it for KFBC radio station here. We shot from the bank up, and it was a microwave shot. It was 5 gig, um, licensed 5 gig. But anyway, Brian was, and these were big dishes. I mean, these were like, I don't know, what, 3, 4 foot dishes that we were shooting back to town. And Brian went up there and was at the back of the antenna we were trying to dial it in. We were looking at the program on the computer and he was twisting. And all of a sudden, he goes, "Hey, is this thing on?" And I went, "Oh, crap." And I shut the power off and I said, "Come on down. Come on down." And I mean, so he kind of didn't feel good for a little while. So you're talking about RF exposure at that frequency. It doesn't just, most of it comes out the front of the dish, but if you're that close to it,
yeah,
it can do some damage. So you got to be very cognizant of that. And we had to do a report and the whole thing. Everything was fine, but I mean, that could have been very bad.
and the one that I read is that one of the major concerns people have, or one of the major concerns that is out there is for your eyes actually. Because your eyes is a closed cell or a closed unit. That's mostly liquid, and heating it's probably not a real good thing.
Well, it's not only the heating, it's also the fact that the cornea or the lens, I can't remember which, it's like the white of an egg. And the heating and the RF exposure there cooks it, and that's where you get your cataracts.
Right.
Don't look into microwaves, especially when the transmitter's on, or into waveguides.
Yeah.
Don't look
Wave
into
guide-
waveguides.
Waveguides can be leaky too, so you never know when you're in that situation.
Yeah.
But that was a bad one. That was one that I'll never forget. And I knew that, but it was just a simple mistake. We were, trying to get the radio station dialed in before the next snowstorm came, so we're kind of in a hurry, and we just forgot to turn the transmitter off. It's like me climbing up on KFBC's AM tower one time, and we had dialed it all down. The tubes were not glowing anymore. We were at 100 watts. Okay, it's good to go. Climb that tower, change them light bulbs. Man, every time I took my hand off and put it back on, even with 100 watts, it was like you could, you weren't on the feed line, but you could feel it. So it was interesting. I told them I wasn't going to do that anymore after that. They get somebody else.
Yeah, and really the main change for this is it's just and I kind of agree with it because coming from a fire safety background, RF exposure doesn't care if you're an amateur, if you're a broadcast, if you're a cell phone manufacturer. RF's RF. So basically they're just consolidating the rules across, and I can see that. Um, and that's if you look. That's why we're limited to the power outputs we're limited to in the amateur range, as far as I can tell. Because the amateur range is kind of the more, if you start running the numbers, If you go below the amateur range, you could run a ton more power and not cause a problem. Or if you go above, you can do pretty good without causing too much problem. So it seems reasonable. And like I say, they're not trying to do a paperwork. They're not trying to kill everyone with paperwork or anything. It's just you need to make sure you're in control of your own stuff. There, I'm off my soapbox. Yes, Bill, I know. I will be back on my soapbox soon enough. Well, that's really all I got. It's nothing too exciting, but I just, like I say, I ran across that in the last week or so, and I knew I wanted to know more about it, so it kind of forced me to learn a bit more about it, and hopefully it makes sense for you all.
Back when they first came out with that requirement, I don't remember, what would you say, 1998?
Yeah.
I think it was. Yeah. So when they first came out with that, there was a lot of confusion among the ham ranks. Is really, I got to go out there and I got to measure all my stuff and I got to do this and do that. And they finally came out and said, if here's the basic rules, and here's what you need to play by. And they gave us charts and stuff, and none of us really understood any of it. Oh, good, they're giving us charts. Now we're totally in compliance because we have these charts, but we haven't done anything to measure our antennas yet because it was kind of a confusing thing to us, because it was new.
And at the time, if they had that chart and you were exempt, and that makes sense. I understand that. But now it's so easy to do, all the online calculators and stuff like that. It's so easy to run it, whereas in 1998, you're not going to,
No, we didn't have a clue. We didn't know what did we need spectrometers?
Yeah. And in the calculations, it's not terrible calculations, but there's many parts to it. So it's not crazy hard math, but there's a bunch of steps to it, and most people gloss over, when you start talking about math. So, whereas with the online stuff, you plug in a couple of things, it spits it out and says yes, no. The only thing they could do to make it any easier is have a smiley face or a frowny face.
Oh, let's go back. Let's just go back to the numbers. We don't need emojis. We understand where we're at.
Yep. Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward.